Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good
Morning.
morning.
Yeah, we're taking it up again in the second Yuma. We're actually going to do a bit of skipping. Let me just reinforce what we were learning last time, because that's the key piece of information that accompanies us for a while. So I'll just share screen with you. All right. The Mishnah in Yuma, the very first Mishnah in Yuma, gave us the halacha of the Kohen Gadol who needs to be separated for 7 days before Yom Kippur. Oh, let me see, one moment, I'm just going, I've forgotten. Where am I? I've forgotten. Mute. I'm muting, and I'm sharing screen again. Okay. So the Kohen Gadol needs to be isolated in his little Lishkas Parhedrin in the Azara of the Beis Hamikdash for 7 days before Yom Kippur. And he gets tutelage while he's there, and he's kept away from stuff that might make him Tomei. But the Gemara, if you remember, wanted to know what the source for this separation was, and it was looking for a scriptural source. And we found that there was a machlokes between two Tanaim, what the scriptural source would be for this period of separation. There were two alternatives. According to one view, it was learned from the din of the separation of the Kohen Gadol before the ritual of the Miluim, when the Mishkan was inaugurated in the Midbar, which we find in Sefer Shemos. Then at that time, before the Korbanos were offered up for the first time really within the Mishkan proper, there was a period at which Aaron was told to separate himself for 7 days and not to go out. And the limud to Yom Kippur was just like the Kohen Gadol, Aaron, was separated for 7 days before being able to enter into the Holy of Holies, if you like, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Mishkan. So it would be when the Kohen Gadol in future on a Yom Kippur, what wishes to enter into the Holy of Holies on the holiest day of the year, that prior to that he also needs 7 days of separation. In fact, the apostle to do with Miluim actually used the additional words lechaper aleichem as a kapara. And the Miluim, the actual inauguration, wasn't a kapara. So the Gemara determined that the posuk in the Miluim included an allusion to a day of kapara, which is Yom Kippur. But on Yom Kippur, as well as during the Miluim, there would be 7 days of separation. That was one scriptural source used to justify the separation of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur. The second one was taking it from Parshas Mishpatim, and it was in relation to the event at Har Sinai of the Seres Adibros. I'm referring you to this screen over here, and it was according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. The Posuk had said in Mishpatim, "Vayishkon kvod Hashem al Har Sinai, vayechasehu e'onon sheshes yomim, vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi mitochei onon." And Rabbi Yossi HaGlili understands this posuk because it's not clear exactly when and where in the whole Matan Torah episode we should place this posuk. But according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, who disagrees, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says that the Aseres Adibros have already been given as far as the verbal communication is concerned. Those statements were made on Har Sinai and all the people heard them. That had happened already. And then Moshe Rabbeinu was to ascend Har Sinai to receive the Luchot, the actual tablets of stone, the physical tablets of stone. It was then that the glory of God dwelt on Har Sinai, and as Moshe was about to ascend the mountain, he was covered over by a cloud for 6 days, which, let's imagine 6 means 7 over here. The Gemara explains why 6 means 7. And it covered Moshe for 7 days. And during those 7 days, he was not at the peak of Har Sinai. He hadn't received the Luchos yet. This was an introductory period of isolation on the mountain where Moshe was entirely on his own, separated from the people, and indeed enveloped in clouds, so he would have been essentially in total darkness. And according to the Tana, who uses this as a source, what we see is a parallel, again, that before Moshe was able to enter into direct communion with HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the top of Har Sinai and receive Alochos, he needed to be in isolation. And therefore, we would say that on Yom Kippur as well, before the Kohen Gadol enters into the service of the holiest day of the year, and eventually he will go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to offer the Keturis there, he also needs a prior period of 7 days of separation. So these were the two different sources. So there's no doubt and no difference of opinion about the practice of the 7 days of separation. It was just simply trying to find a Torah source for both. And that's where really we had reached. I'm going to make a skip now because subsequently the Gemara is going to go through also sort of complicated discussions of Tumah and Tara and of Kodshim, which are related to the Korbanos, related to the Miluim, related also to Hilchot Tumah v'Tara and Mikvah. And I don't want to take you through all that all, otherwise you leave me long before we actually reach the end of that. It's several daf of that, which if you were doing daf yomi or learning Yoma seriously, you would need to learn. But it doesn't add anything more to the information we actually are deriving vis-a-vis the meaning of Yom Kippur and the role of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. It is all a tangent. So therefore, I'm going to move you now. If you have your own Gemara, that's fine. If you're looking at the sheets I sent out. So the first one is Chet Amud Beis 8b. So we're going to do a little bit of 8b. Is it 8b? Yeah, 8b. And then we'll later on go on to 9a. And those are the two sheets I attached to the email. So it's Chet Amud Beis. So on Chet Amud Beis, if you're looking at the sheet or the Gemara, I'm starting from just after 2 dots, 2/3 down the page. After the word B'Shabbos, then it says Lelishka. So if we count from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines from the bottom. And the penultimate word is Lelishkas, and then the next line, Parahedrin, B'chulu. The Gemara now is going to make a little trek back again to the Mishnah, which said that the Kohen Gadol was detained during that 7-day period in the Lishkas HaPehedrin. And just to take you back to that, if you remember, I showed you this diagram originally of the Beis HaMikdash, which is the whole Beis HaMikdash, including the Ezras Noshim over here, the Azara around the Heichal, which is the main building. Here's the Mizbeach, which is like a side-on of the Mizbeach. And there were 2 small chambers. I mean, you can imagine this is quite large. It's just a very small rendering of it. At the corner here, within the Azara, we have chambers 4 and 5. Those are rooms. You imagine you can see this as a plan from above. And according to traditional interpretation of how we understand the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, room 5 was the Lishkas Parahedrin. So you're looking here at where the Kohen Gadol would have been during that period. Let's take you back again. Okay, so I can stop sharing at this point. The Gemara is now going to talk a little bit about this chamber. Again, it's a bit of an aside. You may not be interested in the Lishkas Parahedrin, but there's some interesting historical information that the Gemara is going to bring to our notice. Fascinating information. So the Lishkas Parahedrin, those are the words in the Mishnah which are triggering off the following Gemara. So the Gemara says, Tanya, it was taught in a brisa that on Rabbi Yehuda said the following. Rabbi Yehuda said this, V'chi lishkas parhedrin hoisa? Was this chamber really called lishkas parhedrin? V'halo lishkas balvati hoisa? Well, you may want to know where the Gemara gets this from. Rabbi Yehuda says, in tradition, I'd heard that this chamber wasn't called the Lishkas Parahedrin, at least not originally. It was called the Lishkas Balvoti. So he's going to explain now himself why originally it was called Lishkas Balvoti and then had its name changed to Lishkas Parhedrin. It's like changing the name on your house. The name of the reference on the building was changed from Lishkas Balvoti, the chamber of Balvoti, to the chamber of Parhedrin. And in order to do that, we have to understand the meaning of these two words. Otherwise, the change of names will have no significance. So Parhedrin, the way we understood it, and will become more apparent from the way in which the Gemara discusses it later on, Parhedrin, it's from the Greek, like Sanhedrin, Hedrion actually, Synhedrion, I think it would be in Greek, which means the chamber in which important people or sages are sitting. That would be the Sanhedrin. So the Parhedrin would be a chamber in which the officers of the king would be sitting. That's what the Parhedrin is doing over here. And it's not as if there were necessary officers of the king, but it refers to an important chamber where important officials might be placed. And that's what it was called in our Mishnah. And Rabbi Yehuda's claiming originally that wasn't its name. Its name wasn't the chamber of appointed officials. It was Lishkas Balvati. And there's a subtle difference between the meaning of Balvati and Parhedrin. He says, according to the explanations we see actually in Rashi and elsewhere, Lishkas Balvati means the chamber of ministers or counselors. It'll become apparent that Balvati was a higher level of official than Parhedrin. The Pekidim of the king, the ordinary officials, like the parking wardens, if you like, you might say, or just the appointed people, short term, who are given a license to operate as officers somehow of the king, they're the Parhedrin people. The Balvati people are people who you can't even sack. They're princes. They are the ministers. They sack themselves, if anything, unless there's a democracy. Well, democracy doesn't work very well everywhere anyway. But so the Balvati was a chamber of more important people. So why was it originally called Lishkas Balvati? That was a chamber of very important people. And then later on, the name was degraded, says Rabbi Yehuda, to that of the chamber of simply the civil servants, the appointed officials. Why was this change of name? So now he explains, Ella, Batchila, initially, when the name was Balvoti, Hayukorino saw Lishkas Balvoti, it was called Lishkas Balvoti with a more honorable title, because the Kohanim who were there, the Kohanim Gedolim, during the early days of Bayis Sheni and during Bayis Rishon, were honorable Kohanim Gedolim. They were people who could be trusted, they were genuine, they were Talmidei Chachamim, and they hadn't bought their way in or bribed their way in to the position of Kohen Gadol. So therefore, if they were going to call the name in which the Kohen Gadol was to seclude itself, they would give it a title that fitted with the status of a Kohen Gadol. Since the Kohen Gadol was considered to be a Balvati, a very important and very honored and very trusted and very genuine individual, the chamber had such a name. However, what happened next is that the kahuna corrupted itself. Later on, the next phase, as we get into the Hasmonean kings and onwards, we can talk a little about this. There's some disagreement as to exactly what period in history we're talking about in this later phase of corruption. Exactly when did that start? When individuals started to buy themselves in, so the Kahuna Gadol was considered like having Mafteh Yonah on Yom Kippur. If you were given the position of Kohen Gadol, you were the bee's knees. You were the most important person in the country. Forget the fact that you may not be able to do the service properly. You could probably have anyone's head off who disagreed with you anyway. So as a Kohen Gadol, you had great power, great authority, and great kovod, great prestige as well, wonderful clothing. You went around with all the fineries. You were given a noble house in the Rova HaYehudi, in one of the in the Herodian quarter, etc. Everything was great for you. So people started to give money in order to be given the position of influence and of Kohen Gadol. And when that happened, almost every 12 months there would be a new Kohen Gadol in place. There wasn't one there for a long period of time. Now, there are two reasons for this. One is, as we'll see in a moment, because the Kohanim Gadolim were actually Rishoim, or many of them were Rishoim. Spiritually, they were not up to the task, and they lost their lives, and they did not actually complete a very long term in service of the Kahuna Gedola. But another reason is, with all this intrigue, you probably had one of them knocking off another so he could get into position. So when the Kahuna Gedola became a farce, and at some point, as we see in the Gemara, became a bit of a farce, almost every 12 months, less than a year, a Kohen Gadol was in place, and by the next year there was another Kohen Gadol. So then, Kefahedrin Halalu, these Kohen Gadolim began to gain the appearance of civil servants. Every time the minister wants to get rid of a civil servant, he sacks him. They became temporary residents of their position. And therefore, from that time onwards, they degraded the name of the chamber itself to suit the lower status of Kohen Gadol, who was now taking up position there. Because he was like a parhedrin now. Originally, they were balvotim. They were noble Kohanim Gadolim. And the chamber carried the name which was appropriate to that level of individual. Later on, when it became corrupted, the name was degraded, which is quite interesting, quite an interesting idea. It's as if, around the country, the buzz was, there's not that these people in this room are really not that holy after all. They probably bought their way in with some sort of court intrigue that we're unaware of. So this is what happened. The way Rashi explains, very interesting. It says here, "But parahedron halalo machlifan oso kon shnei masa chodesh." So the way Rashi explains it as well is that when it comes to ordinary officials, not the highest rank, you know what happens when someone's happy with them, they're in. They can't expect to be in place for more than 12 months, and then they're out again. Or some of them maybe buy a status as a tax collector, and they only get a license for a year, and then they're out again. So they're come and go individuals with short tenures. Whereas, the Balvotim were noble Kohanim Gadolim. We talk about those, and they were in place for a very long time. They were long tenure individuals, and we'll see this in a moment. As we're going to do another piece of Gemara before we get to a shtickle that gives us more of a chronological history of the Kohanim Gadolim in both the Bias Rishon period and the Bias Sheni period during both temples. And just in brief, just very, very briefly, because the commentaries have a lot of discussion on this. It's not as simple as it would seem at first sight. The Gemara says later on that during the first Beis Hamikdash, which lasted 410 years, Beis Rishon was 410 years, there were only 18 Kohanim Gadolim during that whole period. During the whole period, there were only about 18 Kohanim Gadolim. And we'll see there's a machlokes with it, 18 or 8 or 12, and goodness knows. But it was a small number. And even if it was 18, that means that each Kohen Gadol had an average tenure of at least 20 years, an average tenure of more than 20 years. And yet, the Gemara will say later on, during Bias Sheni, when the Kahuna Gadola became corrupted, there were, in the 430 years of Bias Sheni, traditionally Bias Sheni lasted 430 years, 20 years longer than Bias Rishon, there were more than 300 Kohanim Gadolim. And the Gemara is going to pick up a few of them who were very, very holy Kohanim Gadolim, who had long tenures, leaving the rest having an average tenure of less than a year each, which is exactly what we want to say over here, that the Kohanim would come and go. During the second Beis HaMikdash, they were literally come and go. Okay, just a little bit of thing on the discussion over the history time periods over here. It says umitoch shenosnim olav moment kahuna. When they started paying money for the kahuna, everything went pear-shaped, and the Kohen Gadol was corrupted, and the people were in for less than a year. When did that happen? Not necessarily all the way through. Now, Rashi mentions that this happened during the Hasmonean period, and we know that not everything in the Hasmonean period was it wasn't necessarily a period we were all very happy with. At the beginning, it was all heroics and the Hanukkah story, but things began to go downhill later on during within probably about 50 years of the Hanukkah story, where there was intrigue, where there was fighting for position, where there was a lack of brotherly love, there was competition for kingship, etc. And he says that's when it started going bad. Now, other Mefarshim say that can't be what the Gemara means when it says mitosha notional of momon lekahuna. That was not yet a period when money was being paid for kahuna. Why not? Because, as you know, the Hashmonaim themselves were Kohanim. They themselves, Yochanan Cohen Gadol, the Matzisyon, they were Kohanim. They were a priestly family. And therefore, the very Melech himself was a Kohen Gadol in many cases. And the Ramban, Nachmanides, criticizes the Hashmonaim for taking on two mantles. They had the mantle of leadership. They took themselves the mantle of kingship as well as the mantle of Kahuna Gedola. Well, you're not allowed to do that in Judaism, you know. We have a separation of state, of government, and religion. Again, we're getting into almost the parallel modern politics today. The king is the king, and the Kohen Gadol is the Kohen Gadol. The two are not one persona, but that was happening. That is a criticism of the Hasmoneans, that they took on two mantles, but they were not paying to be Kohen Gadol, because the kings themselves naturally could take themselves on the position of Kohen Gadol without having to pay anyone. They were able to say, I'm going to be Kohen Gadol, and they were Kohen Gadol. Who would you have to bribe? They didn't need to bribe anyone. So according to other Mefarshim, when it says they started to pay money for the kuna, it means subsequent to the main Hasmonean kings, when we started having the Herodian kings, around that time, a little bit later on, perhaps 100 before the Common Era, around that time, the real Hasmonean kings weren't there anymore, and you began to get an influx of individuals who were close to the Greeks, who were Sadukim, etc., and who wanted those positions. So we were talking about the very end part of the Hasmonean dynasty, the beginning of the post-Hasmonean dynasty, when money was actually paid. So this is not to say that during the Hasmonean dynasty things were good. They were not. But there was a different form of corruption in that the kingship and the Kahuna Gedola were often in the hands of the same person. That itself was not recommended practice. Okay, so the Gemara has now explained, Rabbi Yehuda came in to give us an interesting piece of history to explain why this chamber was originally called the Lishkas Balvoti and then became called the Lishkas Parahedrin. And he's given us this interesting account of the corruption of the Kahuna Gedola. The next thing, the Gemara is now going to bring a Mishnah, which is a bit technically complicated. But amusingly, it's only for one purpose. Even if you did nothing and didn't understand anything to the final line, you get what the Gemara wants to say. This is sometimes what happens. The Gemara will bring a halacha, and the halacha will have a word in it, and that word will give you a clue. Even though you may not need, you have to go through all sorts of learning processes before you get to that word. Now over here, it's the word parahedrin, that's all. And it's almost as if the Gemara is saying over here, spot another place in Shas where the word parahedrin comes in, apart from this Yom Kippur discussion. And it says, oh, I found somewhere else. And that's what the next discussion is going to be about. Simply the word parahedrin, which we said means these appointed officials only there for a year at a time, to which the later corrupt Kohanim Gedolim were compared. We will see that this appears elsewhere in Shas in a completely different context. Okay, so now we make a break with the whole question of the Kohen Gadol and separating, and we're going to move in to a Mishnah from Demai that deals with bakers and taking trumas, masras, masa sheni, masa oni, and challah, all the various tithes and separations. And as I say, this is a little bit of distraction, but it's revision, because we've done this sort of stuff before. You know, in the many years we've been learning together, those who have been with me during that period, we've come across that on more than one occasion. Let me just start the Mishnah over here that the Gemara brings, and then I'll go through some of the stuff on a separate sheet, which I'll share with you. Sanan Hossam, the Mishnah says there, says the Gemara, where else we will have a reference subsequently to Parhedrin. Hanachtomin, a nachtom is a baker. Well, now, what's the situation over here? The bakers were baking large amounts of bread to sell to the public. This is Angels, right? The Angels Bakery. So in order to gather flour to do its baking, it obviously has to buy from scores of small crop farmers who have taken in their wheat, ground it maybe, and then they pass the flour on to the bakers, and the bakers are going to bake the bread. Now, the bakers are buying from all these different crop farmers, and quite a lot of them are amei haaretz. You don't really know whether they've been taking the right tithes. There are lots of tithes to be taken. The tax system is quite complicated in terms of tithes. And some individuals will be pious, others will be less pious. Just like today, you know, when you're buying something abroad, you know, want to go to somewhere to make sure that it's not Israeli produce that hasn't had truma or masa taken to it. Or if you're particular on Shemitah, you know, where did this actually come from? Is it Shemitah lechumra? Is it not lechumra? So over here, there was a more substantial question, because at the time you needed to take these tithes, and you were in Eretz Yisrael, and you were buying from people who were growing here, and you didn't really know whether they'd taken all the necessary tithes. So what do the bakers do now? Are they allowed to bake the dough as if they're totally innocently relying on every one of these supplying farmers having taken the tithes, or should they, out of caution, the bakers themselves, take tithes, just in case the tithes haven't been taken? And don't forget, that would lose the bakers a lot of money. They'd be buying all this. It may have been pre-tithed. Who knows? We don't have kashrus mahadrin officials going around every farm providing a stempel to show that the flour they provided the baker has been suitably tithed. So let's just read this Mishnah. Hanachtumin, says the Mishnah, quite surprisingly, lo chiyavu oson chachamim lahafrish ella trumas masa v'chala. When it came to being cautious, the Chachamim only laid a low burden on the bakers. Not that they have to start from first principles, just in case, taking truma, masa, trumas masa, masa sheni, all these different types, which we'll look at in a moment. They didn't require them to do that, but they did require them to take 2 of those tithes, lechumra. And what were there? Trumas masa, which we'll see in a moment. Trumas masa is the tithe the Levi gives to the Kohen. It's like truma, which goes to the Kohen from the individual, but when the individual gives to the Levi his 10%, the Levi himself has to give his own truma. And challah, that's the separation from the dough that you're kneading, which is at when they start baking process, that's always for the baker to do. That really is for the baker to do. But the trumas masa has to be taken. What about truma and everything else? Surely you don't know whether the farmers have actually taken truma gedola, as it's called, some of the other tithes. We'll have a look at that in a moment. The Gemara is going to ask, why is it that you can rely on the fact that the other tithes have been taken, and we don't require the nachtumin to take out of doubt or out of caution? You only require them to take trumas masa. So I'm going to share my screen with you so we can look at these tithes together, and it'll make a little bit more sense as we go through the Gemara. Share screen. Okay, I must have shown you something like this, so I said it in a different way. You have a crop farmer, and if he does everything correctly, he should take these tithes before he actually sells them on. So this is what he should normally do. This is not what the people who are not particular are doing. This is what a person who is particular should do. In other words, this is a tax system. This is the tithes tax system. He harvests 100 units of crop, the farmer. Now he's supposed to give 2% of that. It's not a lot. 2%, actually, according to our Torah, there's no fixed amount. 2% was an amount recommended by Chazal to be given to the Truma, to the Kohen. So a Kohen who comes knocking at his door, comes to the farmhouse, he would send 2% of 2 units, whatever units are, out of 100 units, 2%, and that's called Truma Gedola sometimes, the great Truma, which the original picker or the original farmer has to give to the Kohen. That actually, in terms of what it means on the residual amount, well, he has 98 units remaining. The farmer has given 2 away. Now, he has to give 10%, much larger amount, to the Levi. So because the Levi doesn't get all sorts of korbanos and everything else and the stuff that the Truma, that the Kohen gets. So he has to give 9.8. The tax is only based on what's left. The second thing in the schedule, he gives 10% of the remaining 98, 9.8 to the Levi. Of which, now here we just make a little bit of a detour, the Levi himself has received 9.8 units. He has to give 10% of his 9.8, 0.98 units to the Kohen. In other words, there are 2 donors to a Kohen. Not necessarily the same Kohen, makes no difference. There's the original farmer who is usually a Yisrael, he gives 2 units. And then the Levi himself has to give 10% of his 10% to the Kohen. So he gives 0.98. So the Levi has to give a little bit of his own to the Kohen. Okay, as far as the farmer is concerned, he's given 9.8 away. So he's left with 98 less 99.8, which is 88.2. 88.2 units remaining with a farmer. Next tax system, he has to give 10%, which is either going to be Ma'aseh Sheni or Ma'aseh Oni. Now, it's a little bit more complicated over here. It depends upon which year in the 7-year Shemitah cycle it is. On some years, the 10% is deemed to be Ma'aseh Oni, and it goes to the poor. It's a stocker to the poor. On other years, it's called Ma'aseh Sheni. Now, Ma'aseh Sheni is a tax to himself. Isn't that interesting? Judaism has a tax to yourself. That means you take off 10%. In the Ma'aseh Sheni year, he would have to take 8.82 units, and he was supposed to take it up to Yerushalayim and eat it in Yerushalayim. In other words, that's why I call it a tax to himself. He's not giving it away to anyone, but it's supposed to be taken up to Yerushalayim. This is the idea that the farmer goes up once a year to Yerushalayim and he eats there, and you have lots of simcha in Yerushalayim. Instead of eating it in your own backyard in Jaffa somewhere, he takes it up to Yerushalayim. So Yerushalayim is full of people eating trumas and masras, and it's a great happy place. It's a great happy bubble. So 8.82 units you take up. There's another possibility. It could be poderit. You're allowed to redeem it. If he's got a lot of stuff, he could actually, instead of taking up the 8.82 units of corn or whatever it is, he could redeem it by money's value. He gets it assessed. It's 8.82 units are worth 8.82 shekels. So what he does is he redeems it on the money. He can then eat the crop, but he has to take 8.82 shekels up to Yerushalayim, and then he buys it, he uses it to buy bread in Angel's Bakery. Isn't that wonderful? So that actually gives custom to the merchants of Yerushalayim. One way or another, he's supposed to go up to Yerushalayim, either with the original 8.82 units or with the money's worth and buy there. It's a simcha b'Yerushalayim. I call this a tax to yourself. Any case, what is he left with at home? 79.38 units, you could say. If it is Ma'aseh Oni, it goes directly on those years to the pauper. So you have a tax rate of about 20.6% overall on this basis. And on top of that, he would give taxes to the governor and to the Roman this and to whoever is going to threaten to hang him if he doesn't, to whatever it is. So it was tough being a farmer in those days. But that is the sequence of tithes. Now, the Gemara is going to want to explain why we're being so kind to this baker. Let's look at this chart again. Very interesting. There's a lot of chives here. There's a 2% that should go to the Cohen. If the Nachtom, the baker, is buying it from an unreliable farmer, how does he know that the farmer actually gave his 2% to the Cohen? And yet the Mishnah says he doesn't have to give that. He doesn't have to take that again as a cautious tithe. He only has to take again. You know what he has to give? Only the Trumas Masa. The 0.98 that the Levi should have given to the Cohen, that's the only stuff the baker has to take. Isn't he lucky? Very low tax rate. He doesn't have to give the 10%. We'll see why in a moment. He only has to take this 0.98 of the original, what was 100, let's say he bought 100 units from the farmer. He only has to take 0.98 and give it to the Cohen. And also we say challah. Challah is the dough, because he's making his own dough. That's for him to do. That's not surprising. So we're treating, and we don't know that he's given 9.8 to the Levi. Maybe he hasn't. Why shouldn't he have to give 9.8 to the Levi in case 9.8 was not given by the unreliable farmer? Why shouldn't he have given 2%? Why shouldn't he give why shouldn't he have to take up 8.82 of Maaseh Sheni to Yerushalayim? Why are we letting him get away with this? Don't forget, there's a big sofek. You've got an Amharetz he's bought it from, someone who does not have a reputation as being religious. Maybe he should have to take everything here, all these tithes, as a precaution, because the original farmer did not take. That's the subject of this discussion now. So let's now go back and see it on the page. I'm just going to quit sharing a moment so you can study the page, which I hope you are. So the Gemara says, Bishlama Truma Gedol. This is the last line on 8b Chesom on the base. Bishlama Truma Gedola Lo. I understand why we won't ask him to give those two units to the Cohen that were Truma Gedola. The Gemara is going to explain, unpick this slowly, and he's going to say, I don't have a problem that he doesn't have to give those 2% to the Cohen, even though we have no proof he's actually given it. Why I'm not concerned that Chazal don't require him to give those two out of precaution, for the following reason. The Tanya, and here we turn over the page. Lefi, this is like in the middle of a brisa somewhere, you've got to know what the context is. Shesholach b'chol gevule Yisrael v'ro'a she'ein mafrishit ella truma gedola bilvad. Fascinating brisa this is. That says that Yochanan Cohen Gadol, we're not quite sure which Yochanan Cohen Gadol this was actually, he conducted one of the first public opinion polls in history. And he sent his agents around all of the farmyards, if you like, of Eretz Yisrael with clipboards. And they came back with a record, I don't know how they got this information, of which farmers, if you like, were actually genuinely deducting which tithes, which of these 5 or so tithes had been taken. And in that survey, it became absolutely clear that almost everyone was separating Truma Gedola. In other words, the fear of God was sufficiently within all the farmers that they gave the main Truma to the Cohen. Why was that? Probably, as the Mefarshim say, because the din of Truma is very severe, and a Truma is a form of kodshim, not like Maisa, we'll see in a moment. It has sanctity, and there is a halacha that one is chayav misa b'dei shamayim. There's no death penalty for it in terms of the court system, but b'dei shamayim, in the eyes of heaven, you may well be knocked on the head if you don't give your truma to the Kohen. And therefore, even in Amoritz, it's like most majority of people, even though it's Israel, they fast on Yom Kippur, maybe more as a tradition than anything else. So if you like, the Truma Gedola, the 2% you have to give to the Kohen was there on Yom Kippur. So virtually every one of these farmers was actually giving. Therefore, that being the case, the bakers were not required to take that 2% because it was obvious that nearly every source for the baker's flour would have given that 2%. It was not the question of doubt at all. Okay, so, but it was only Truma Gedola they could be trusted for. So now the Gemara is going to say, what about those other Trumas? If they didn't take anything else, why don't you have to give Maser Sheni and all this other stuff as well? And Maser to the Levi? Why didn't they require the bakers to take for those? There was no evidence that these were being given by the majority of the population. Okay, so the Gemara goes on to explain this. Maser Rishonu Maser Oni Namilo. I also can figure out why Chazal didn't require the bakers to take Maser Rishon, which was that 10% that goes to the Levi, just in case it wasn't taken, and in most cases it wouldn't have been taken. And also Maser Oni, the stuff that goes to the poor on certain years of the cycle. Says the Gemara, I can understand why that also wasn't forced to be taken by the by the baker. Why? And the Gemara gives a very interesting reason for why I can understand, because maybe you should say you don't understand. He hasn't. We've just seen from this public survey that most did not take Maser to the Levi, and they didn't give Maser to the Oni. So what do you mean they don't have to? The Gemara says, no, I do understand why we can't force the baker to take again. Why? Hamotzi mechaveru olavaraya. Now, there's a lot of discussion as to why you can apply this principle over here. If a person's asking you to give something, prove that in fact you need to give it. This is a general rule in Bava Metzia, not even normally talking about Kochim and Trumas and Maestras, that if a person is trying, if I have a din Torah with someone and I say they owe me money, I say they owe me money, and I have no raya, I have no evidence to prove it, I might as well just go home. I can scream and jump as much as I want. Since they're the ones holding the money now, for me to say that 3 years ago you lent me, I lent you money, that's for me. If I've got no shtar, I've got no eidim, tough. Before I can extract anything from anybody else, I have to have evidence supporting me. Over here, before the baker needs to give 10% to a Levi has to give evidence that flour has not previously had Maser taken from it. Because the baker can say, how do you know this hasn't, I'm not going to give you. You come knocking at my door saying, well, you know, probably the no Maser was taken. Prove it. It's not enough to prove it to say the majority of people don't give. Motzi Chaverim Oliver means you have to have a completely cast iron proof that Maser was not taken. Only then will you have to give it. Because Maser itself has no sanctity. It's not like Truma. There is no din of Misa B'dei Shemayim for a person who doesn't give Maser to the Levi. In other words, the din of giving Maser to a Levi turns out is quite a weak one. There is such a halacha, but it's only weakly applied. And you've got to be a good boy to give it. So over here, Chazal did not say to the baker, go and take Maser again, because maybe the Levi never received it. Because we can say, well, there's no sanctity over here, so therefore, before I have to give it to a Levi has to come to me with photographic evidence that no Maser was ever taken. And since he will never be able to have that evidence, therefore I don't have to give, right? And we're doing all this to be nice to the Nachton, by the way. We'll see later on why we're very, very sympathetic with bakers who try to serve the community. We're not trying to throw every possible suffix and doubt in Chumrah them at all. That's what you can see over here. So the Gemara is going to say, and that's why I understand that we don't reimpose as a precaution that the baker has to give Maser Rishon or Maser Oni. Ella, the Gemara says, my only question, why did they not impose or require on Maser Sheni? And a Maser Sheni, the bit that you have to take up to Yerushalayim, the bit you have to take up to Yerushalayim, which is a tax to yourself, as I showed you before. Nifreshu v'nisku v'nechlu Yerushalayim. Let him take it up and eat in Yerushalayim. In other words, Chazal should not have been so light and lenient with him as far as not requiring Maaseh Sheni to be taken. Why is the Gemara saying that? Because he doesn't have to give it any away. Maaseh Sheni is something he's giving himself anyway. The only din with Maaseh Sheni is that you have to take it up to Yerushalayim. What kind of imposition is it? It's not as if we're asking the baker to have to give something away which is in doubt as to whether it needs to be given away. He's not giving it away at all. He's merely asking to relocate himself and eat this. He will be getting the benefit, he and his family anyway. So why don't we require the din of Maaseh Sheni to be taken up to Yerushalayim? That's what the Gemara is saying. That is something is not going to be a big imposition, because he's not going to make a financial loss, because he's going to be able to eat that himself. It's not as if he has to give it to a third party. It's not going to a Levi, it's not going to a Cohen, it's not going to an Oni, it's staying with himself. He just has to eat in Yerushalayim, or he can be poder it. He can redeem it on money and take the money up to Yerushalayim. Why do you say that he doesn't have to do anything vis-a-vis Maaseh Sheni? So the Gemara now answers, and here's where you see the sympathy that Chazal had for the bakers. Next time you go into Angel's Bakery, you will take a completely different attitude to the person serving behind the counter. So Amma Ula, so said Ula, and now we see the magic word appearing, which is the only reason we're bringing this whole discussion. Mitoch parhedrin halolu. It's because, the magic word parhedrin appears. Because these parhedrin guys, who is the parhedrin? These officials who are put into a situation of administrative authorities, who are not very nice, by the way. They were being put in those positions very often, as we'll see, by the Persians during the Persian governmentship, and later on maybe by the Roman government, governor, etc. You know, if you're a tax collector or if you were an official, then usually you were doing it for gain, and you were usually not particularly nice to your own population. Even if you were Jewish, you may have been a pretty scoundrel type person, because these parhedrin officers, who are these? We'll see who they are in a moment. Chov Tinoson used to chastise, used to beat up the bakers. Kol Shnei Mosar Chodesh. Every 12 months, the bakers would be beaten up. Why? Because every 12 months, we said that these officials would usually have only short sessions before they were replaced. Every time a new official came in, the first thing he would do would be to beat up the bakers. Why? Why shouldn't he beat up the butchers? Why is he beating up the bakers? It's not at all clear, is it? So every time they came in, these poor bakers were the victims of continuous punishment. Kol Shnei Mosar Chodesh doesn't mean regularly every 12 months. It doesn't mean every 1st of January. It means, continuously there would be a changing of the guard amongst these parhedrins, and each time they came in, they were more aggravating again to the bakers. And what would they do, these parhedrin? For Omrin, they would demand michro bezol, and it's not clear why they would say that. You know what that means? They said, send something really good, sell cheap. Sell cheap. Well, don't we all want to buy cheap from angels? We would praise people who were telling the bakery, sell cheap. And over here, we're saying the poor bakers were the victims of these officials telling them to sell cheap. Let's just finish the last few words. Lo atrechu harabonon. Given that the rabbis had compassion on these bakers who were kept getting beaten on the head each time a new official came in, telling him, sell cheap, bring down your prices, therefore the Chachamim said, you cannot impose anything difficult on these poor Nachtomin. Their life is full of hardship anyway. And even if you ask them, what you're going to do, ask them, let's say you say Maaseh Sheni, you've got to take Maaseh Sheni. You're going to ask them to take the stuff up to Yerushalayim. I mean, you're going to make that, that's also difficult. They're going to have a lot of flour, which they're going to get from people. Then if you ask them to take Maaseh Sheni, cautionary basis, they're going to have to take cartloads of flour or some sort of crop up to Yerushalayim, you're going to make their life a misery, not because they're going to lose, well, maybe they will lose money, because time is money. They're going to get to Yerushalayim, they're going to get back again, even though they can eat all this stuff when they get to Yerushalayim. Does that make this easier? No, we don't make a demand on them at all. We make a minimum demand on them out of caution. They take Trumas Masa because we are fairly certain that the original farmer didn't take. And that is something which is very severe. It's a form of truma. There's misa b'dei shamayim, etc. We force them to take that, and that's only 0.98 units in 100, and therefore minimum pressure, maximum compassion. The question over here is, why should a new Parahedron guy, you've just got a new job as a Parahedron official, which makes you like the inspector of all stores or something like that, and maybe you've got a 12-month contract, and each 12 months, you know, you buy the rights to have it again. Maybe that's what these Parahedron officials were doing almost, you know, annually renewable civil servants. So you had your position. Why would the first thing you did in your new practice position be to visit the local bakeries and say, bring down your prices, bring down your prices? What you'd expect them to say is, bribe me, bribe me. And maybe there was a bit of that. And the Mefarshim, I'm not sure the Mefarshim are giving all a proper explanation of this. It seems that they would impose penalties on the bakers. It could be they were saying, if you didn't bring down your prices, we will impose a fine on you. And therefore, they had to bring down their prices or they had to pay a fine. However, the way they understand this is that it was providing unfair market pressure on bakeries, which other professions were not suffering. I don't know why they didn't do the same to the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers. It seems the bakers were the main target of their abuse. And they were doing this, each time they did this, the margins that the bakers had were so low, they could barely make a living. So here you have Angel's Bakery, their margin is 0.25% because they got these people knocking them their head. They have to sell everything at government controlled prices, not a bit more, even though their costs go up of imports, etc., and from their farmers, they're still not able to raise their prices. You can have a lot of Rahmanas for these Nachtomin, and this is why Chazal didn't want to impose any more burdens on them. Another possibility, actually, why would they say bring down prices, bring down prices? It could be that every time new officials came in, they wanted to curry favor with the population, right? What's the first thing that a minister comes in to his department in the Knesset? What pressure is Smotrich under right now? He's the finance secretary. Forget about everything else that he does. He has just refused to raise prices on petrol or on fuel, on fuel for a while longer. The tax was supposed to go up. He's delayed it again. He made various changes in terms of importing from abroad, even though it's going to essentially harm some local butter and milk manufacturers in Israel, in order to keep the prices low. Why is he doing that? Either because he's a tzaddik, or because he was voted into power, and as I say, he wants to have these great tzedakahs under his belt. He has been kind to the population. He's kept prices low. Every time you forcibly keep prices low, there's a victim. The victim is often the farmer locally. It could be the supermarket whose margins are going to become tighter and tighter because you're controlling the market. That's what Smotrich is doing. He's doing it correctly, maybe. I'm just telling you, this is naturally what everyone in power needs to do, to curry favor with the public who voted for them. And you have the new Parahedron coming. Each time they come in, they want to make sure that they will have some achievements. And the achievement was, during my 12 months, I made sure that Angel's bakery prices never, ran higher than the increasing by the cost of inflation, whatever. Okay. So that's the story. And the only reason we brought the words Parahedron is to show that these were people, officials coming in normally for a short term. And we compared that to these Kohanim Gedolim that came in, were only in position for a few months or a year at a time because they were such lousy characters, or because they were kicked out by the next greedy incumbent. Finally, the Gemara just gives you a translation, my Parhedrin, as if the Gemara is finally saying, well, we've talked about the Parhedrin, but what is a translation of the word Parhedrin? And of course, the Gemara gives us the translation into an even more untranslatable word. So you go out of the firewood into the fire, and it's porsi, out of the frying pan into the fire. It means porsi. What a porsi? Well, porsi seems to be a Persian word, which also means the officials of a king. So if you didn't know, Parhedron has a Greek origin. It's from the Greek. And it could be that at some point in time, when the Greeks didn't have that much influence anymore, but there were still people who had a Persian influence, or maybe during the Babylonian time in Bovel, they had a closer contact with a Persian structure of officialdom than the officialdom as it was in Eretz Yisrael under Greek titles. So therefore, they've replaced the word Parhedrin, if you like, or translated it into the vernacular of people in Bovel, which was Porsi, which would mean the officials of the king. People who were placed in positions probably for limited periods of time and then would be exchanged. And I think we'll stop over here. Next week, the Gemara is going to give us a history of the Kahunas Gedolaship, if you like, during the First and Second Temple periods. Very intriguing. It's going to bring sources from Divrei Hayomim again, and we'll see why there were only 18 Kohanim Gedolim during the first period, etc. So we'll be going into some biographical detail next week. So let me just, 1 second, I'll cease recording.